In this video, I'm going to take just a few minutes and discuss the three primary elements in photography that you need to know and understand thoroughly regarding exposure in order to shoot in manual mode. If you're going to take your photography to the next level, and I want you to, it is absolutely essential that you understand what effect each of these three elements has on your photos, and even more importantly, how they relate together so that you can apply them in your photography. Regardless of whether you photograph people, products, wildlife, landscapes, or anything else, these three elements always come into play and affect the final photo. In fact, in just about every photo you've ever seen or taken, some combination of these three elements factored into the final image. The three elements I'm talking about are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now I know some of you are saying, wait, I've been taking great photos for years and I've never once had to deal with any of those things. Well, that's because virtually every digital camera sold has an automatic setting, and even if they don't know it, it's what most people are using when they pull out their camera to take a quick photo of their kids, or while they're on vacation, or to upload to Facebook or email or whatever. So when you're shooting in automatic mode, you're essentially letting the camera make the decision for you about the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. But no camera is as smart as you, and your photography skills and the photos you take for yourself and for other people will benefit greatly the more you take matters into your own hands and learn how to shoot in manual mode and control the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO by yourself. Now, not all point and shoot cameras have a manual mode, but many do, and all DSLR cameras which allow interchangeable lenses have a manual mode. For purposes of this discussion, we're going to assume that you have a camera that will allow you to shoot in manual mode and to control these three elements independently. Now, there are some modes that are on your camera that allow for partial manual control while still letting the camera make some decisions, and those can be very useful at times, namely shutter priority and aperture priority. But to get the most use out of even those modes, you still need to fully understand just what each of the three elements of exposure controls and how they can affect your photography. So let's talk about aperture for a moment. Aperture is also called f-stop by photographers. Aperture is referring to the lens of your camera and the actual opening in the center of the lens, which actually can go wider or narrower depending on the effect you want to create. Now, I personally love aperture. That's what I think about most, probably more than shutter speed and ISO combined. In fact, I'm usually adjusting the ISO and the shutter speed to try to get the aperture I want in a photo. Now, the reason for this is that the aperture actually controls the depth of field of a photo. Now, the depth of field is basically how much of the photo is going to be in focus and how much of it is not going to be in focus. Now, when I do photography of people or products, I'm oftentimes looking for what's called a shallow depth of field, where the person or the object that I'm photographing is in crisp focus, but the background is maybe out of focus, a lot or a little bit. Other times, I'm wanting the background to be part of the photo, so I want everything to be in focus. Now, the best way to think about the aperture is to refer or relate it to your eye. And your eye is basically very similar to the lens on your camera, which you just think about that as the eye of your camera. And you just think about when you really want to let in a lot of light, you open up your eyes really wide. Now, that does let in a lot of light, but it also limits the depth that you can actually focus on. When you want to see something in greater detail or that's maybe far away, you squint your eyes really tight and you can see a little bit farther. It lets in less light, but it also creates greater depth of focus. Now, the aperture, as I mentioned before, is measured in what's called f-stops. And without getting into the math of everything, it's just important to know that the lower the f number, the wider open the aperture. And the higher the f number, it's more closed down. So with a more open aperture or a lower f-stop, lower f number, you're going to get a shallower depth of field. The iris of the lens is going to be much wider. It's going to let in more light, but it's going to focus on a much narrower plane. We call them focal planes. Now, with a higher f-stop, say in the neighborhood of 11 or 16, the lens is going to be closed down real tight, or it's also called stopped down, only letting in a little amount of light when the shutter goes off, but it's going to be in greater focus. The focal planes will be much deeper of the things that are actually in focus in the photo. So, lower f number, more light, less focus. Generally when you're photographing people or portraits and you just want the person in focus and the background kind of out of focus, you want to use a low f-stop, which is also called a wider aperture. Now that is going to be letting in more light, so you're going to have to adjust with the shutter speed and the ISO, and we'll get into how those interrelate later. But right now we just want to have an understanding of what the aperture is on the lens and how you can use it. So a low number, wider aperture, less depth of field. The higher number is greater depth of field and less light coming in. Now the second component of the equation of exposure is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is probably the easiest one to understand. It is actually just a measurement of time that the shutter is open to let in light when the shutter actuator is depressed. And it's measured in fractions of a second. So generally you will see on your camera, say either 1/100 or maybe even just 100. That refers to 1/100th of a second. And that is the actual length of time that the shutter opens to let in light and then closes. And when you're shooting in manual mode, this can be adjusted. Depending on your camera, some of them you can leave the shutter open as long as, say, 30 seconds, which would maybe be used to photograph the stars at night when there's almost no light available. Other times you may be in the bright sunlight and you may be taking a picture at 1/2000th of a second. These are things that you need to practice and get used to using when you're learning to shoot in manual mode. And there are different reasons and times where you want the shutter speed to be slower or faster to create different effects. For example, if you're shooting sports or something that's moving quite quickly, you want to be able to freeze the action, so you're going to want a very quick shutter speed. Rule of thumb, when I photograph sports, I usually never shoot at less than 1/500th of a second shutter speed. I generally actually prefer to go even more than that. So that's one thing you just need to understand about shutter speed, is all it does is measures the amount of time that the shutter opens and closes to let light into the camera sensor. And this will relate to the aperture, as we talked about in the other one, about how long the aperture, or how wide the aperture is the amount of light that comes in, and the shutter speed is the length of time that the shutter is open to let the light in. So generally speaking, when you have a wider aperture, you're going to have a quicker shutter speed. If you have a much narrower aperture, a higher number where the focal focus is deeper and it's stopped down to a higher number, you're going to have a slower shutter speed to let in the same amount of light to get your proper exposure. Now the final component in this exposure equation is what's called the ISO. In the old days of film cameras, they used to have different speeds of film, and they would call that number the ASA. But since probably nobody watching this video is going to be shooting with film, we are just going to talk about the ISO. And this number refers to the sensitivity to light of your sensor, and this can actually be adjusted to greater sensitivity to light, and it can be reduced to make your sensor less sensitive to light. Now there's a little bit of a trade-off here. With the lower sensitivity to light, the quality of the image is actually higher. So the lowest you can go on the ISO, you're going to get the highest quality image when you get down to the pixels. As you increase the ISO, it makes the sensor in your camera much more sensitive to light, but the trade-off is there is more what's called grain or noise in your photo. So if you were to blow up an image that was shot at a very high ISO, you would see lots of grain or noise. It wouldn't be very pleasing to the eye unless that's perhaps the look you were going for. So as a quick example, ISO 100 is a pretty standard ISO that you would use on your camera. That's probably when you turn your camera on, it's going to be set to ISO 100, maybe 200. As the numbers double, so from 100 to 200, your sensor is actually going to be twice as sensitive to light. So you go from 100 to 200, the next full stop of light, there's that f-stop number again, the next stop is going to be 400. After that, the next stop will be 800, and as you can see, it just keeps increasing. But for right now, the important thing to realize is that to understand is that the lower the ISO, the less sensitive your camera's sensor is going to be to light, the higher the ISO, the more sensitive it will be, but also the less quality. You're going to sacrifice some quality in your image. Okay, so now that we've talked about the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, and you understand what those are, how do we put those all together and get the types of photos that we want? Now, when you're shooting in manual mode, you have control over the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So it really puts you in control to create the effect that you're looking for the different types of photography that you may be doing. Some of you may be doing sports photography, some of you may be doing wildlife photography or architecture. It's all going to depend on you, but when you have the tools and the understanding on how to shoot in manual mode, you'll be able to tackle different settings with, say, low light or a lot of light or a fast moving object or a slow moving object, and be able to adapt to the different types of scenarios that you may encounter. Now, just to recap really quickly, aperture measures the opening of the lens, the iris of the lens. It's like the eye of the camera. A low F number, say 1.4, 1.8, 2.0, that's going to indicate a very wide opening of the lens, which lets in a lot of light, but it's a very shallow depth of field. Sometimes that's very desirable. If you're doing portrait photography and you just want a person's face in focus and the background out of focus, you'll be using a low F number. Now on the other side, if you want everything in focus or very sharp detail, maybe you're photographing jewelry or product photography, and you want everything as crisp as possible, you will want to stop down, which tightens down the lens, the iris in the lens, and goes to a higher F number, say 11 or 13 or 16. And you're going to be letting in less light, and you're going to have to adjust the shutter speed accordingly, and we'll get to that. The next step is the shutter speed. So you've adjusted the aperture the way you want it, now you have the shutter speed. Shutter speed is just simply a measurement in fractions of a second of how long the shutter stays open when you press down the button. And that's how long the shutter is open to let light into the camera. Finally, there's the ISO, which measures the sensitivity of the sensor to light. When the shutter opens, how sensitive is your camera's sensor to light? You go up to a higher number, it's more sensitive to light, but you also may sacrifice some quality. So I'm going to go through some real-world examples, just for instance here and there. And obviously you can do some work out in the field on your own. That's ultimately how you're going to learn the most, is by trial and error. This was very overwhelming to me, so you may even want to watch this several times over until it starts to make sense. I can't tell you, it would be almost embarrassing if I told you how many times I had to revisit these things until they really started to make sense in my mind, and I could reconcile how these three elements, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, could be manipulated by me shooting in manual mode to basically accommodate any situation I found myself in and get any result that I wanted, whether I was photographing a person or landscape or sports or something like that. So putting in the time to understand this, and then putting the time in the field could just be your living room or out in your backyard, to understand it, it will pay dividends in the end, as you learn to take control of your photography and create the types of photos you want. And at that point, you will be able to start to develop your own style and also decide what kind of photos you really like to take. So without rambling on any further, let's take some real-life examples, and I'll just kind of explain how I might be adjusting things to try to get that proper exposure. Because ultimately what we're looking for is an image that is properly exposed and also contains the elements or artistic characteristics that we want. So let's go to the most obvious one first. So let's say we are shooting a person. Maybe it's a headshot. Maybe your friend said, hey, I'm going to start acting. I would really like a headshot, or maybe a photo of my kid or something like that. And you want to go for that look where the person's face is really in focus, the background's kind of out of focus. Maybe you go outdoors. So now you're dealing with a situation where there's light outdoors. It may be a cloudy day, or it may be a sunny day. So if you're shooting a portrait like that, where you want a shallow depth of field, you want the background kind of blurry, you want the person's face in focus only, so you're going to go for a low aperture. And I would recommend anywhere from 1.8 to 2.8 is a good rule of thumb for those types of photos, where you just want that person's face in focus, and you kind of want the background to fade out in the distance. So you're going to start with the aperture. Let's start it at 2.5. That will make it so that the focus isn't too sensitive, but their face is going to be nicely in focus and things are going to be in the background out of focus. So we started with 2.5. Let's say we start with a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, and your ISO is kind of the camera's default at ISO 100. Okay, so you snap your first photo, and you know what? It's too dark. The person's, really, maybe there's shadows going on that you don't like, and you know that the photo is just too dark. It's what we call underexposed. You need to let in more light. Well, you know that you could let in more light by opening up the aperture to an even lower number, but you really want that to stay at 2.5. When you open it up lower than that, more things go out of focus. Maybe the person's ear goes out of focus and you need that in focus. So it's out of the question to adjust the aperture, so we need to leave that at 2.5. We could bring the shutter speed down from 100th of a second to, say, a 50th of a second. That would actually leave the shutter open twice as long. You'd be letting in twice as much light, and that would actually be known as a full stop of light. We'll go into that maybe more detail in another video, but a stop of light is actually referring to doubling the amount of light that hits the sensor, or even dividing it into half the amount of light. So when you talk about stops, you're actually talking about doubling the amount of light exponentially. But without getting into all that, say you go from 100th of a second to a 50th of a second. Well, your exposure now is absolutely correct. It's spot on. So at f2.5, your aperture, and 100th of a second was too dark, but a 50th of a second is good. But here's another thing. When your shutter speed slows down, your sensor is also more sensitive to any movement of the subject, and you can lose some sharpness and focus. If the person's moving at all, or maybe there's a little bit of wind where it wouldn't have picked it up at 100th of a second, now it's picking it up at a 50th of a second, and you're just getting a little bit of out of focus blur that you don't want. So you know your shutter speed has to stay at 100th. You know your aperture is at 2.5. What's left? ISO. Bumping your ISO from 100 to 200 will double the amount of light that hits your sensor, has the exact same effect as lowering your shutter speed from 100th of a second to a 50th of a second. But it allows you to keep your shutter speed at 100th of a second, which you need so that the blowing hair or the person moving doesn't show up in the photo. And you're able to keep your wide open aperture so you get that nice fuzzy background. And you just bumped your ISO up from 100 to 200. You got your perfectly exposed image. Problem solved right there. Basically, remember that the ISO, every time you double it, it doubles the amount of light that comes in. Now with the shutter speed, also, as you half that, every time you divide it in half, you're doubling the amount of light that comes in. On the aperture side, and we didn't touch on this too much, or really at all in the aperture lesson, but every f-stop of light, or f-stop number, a full f-stop, will either double or half the amount of light. So what you're really dealing with in each of these components, you've got your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. You're controlling how much light comes in, and they all interrelate to get your perfectly exposed image. Now we could go over different scenarios and other examples, but I think ultimately you're going to get the most benefit from actually going out there and doing it yourself and trying, in a given situation, I'm going to adjust the aperture here and see what happens, and then compensate with a shutter speed. But it's really important to understand the relationship of these elements. In other words, when you increase the ISO, more light's going to come in. So to compensate for that, you may need to increase the shutter speed or increase the aperture to maintain the same exposure. So elements that are frequently used in aperture, I mentioned I use that more than anything else. I'm always thinking about the aperture. In this photo, do I want, how blurry do I want the background? Or how sharp do I want the focus? Do I want to be able to see the trees in the distance in perfect clarity, I know I'm going to need a real sharp aperture, so I may need to bump the ISO up because not much light will be coming in when I depress the shutter because I'm maybe shooting at f/16. So I'm going to either need a really slow shutter speed or a higher ISO. And just understanding the relationship between all of those things, and you're usually leading with you want a certain aperture or you want a certain shutter speed if you're, say, doing sports, or you can't go too slow on the shutter speed, so you're going to need to have a wider open aperture or a higher ISO in order to let more light in. Those are the kinds of things that you could listen to me and rewind it and it would make some sense, but until you really practically apply it, it's going to make more sense to you when you do it that way. Well, I hope this tutorial has been helpful for you. I've had a lot of fun doing it. The main reason that I did it is that when I was learning about all these things and starting photography and getting beyond just the regular point and shoot, shooting in automatic mode, I was looking for anything I could to try to figure out what in the world was going on with this aperture and the shutter speed and ISO, and I really couldn't find any single tutorial that really covered all of these elements and how they work together. I would find a video on aperture and I started to understand depth of field, and then obviously I kind of knew shutter speed was a measurement of how fast the shutter was going, and I didn't really understand ISO at all and how I could make those three things work together. And ultimately it was just going out and doing it on my own that helped me learn the most, but it would have helped if I had seen something that really endeavored at least to explain these things. And I know I've been a little long-winded, and I thank you for your patience, but I hope this has been helpful to you, and I'm excited for you to go out and to put these things into practice and to start developing your own style and your own method of photography. And it's a very exciting journey, and it's one that I'm continually on, and I would no means consider myself an expert yet. I'm constantly learning, but I'm enjoying it every step of the way, and I know you will be too. And thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing your pictures soon.